Welcome, Koo, to this episode of the Art Materials Advisor. We're going to be talking exclusively about Silverpoint, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Yeah,
it's our pleasure. And you and I have known each other for quite a long time, actually. I think it was the late 90s. I met you at a Tempera Society meeting. And of course, at that time, I was starting my interest in tempera. And so can you explain, how did you get interested in, and I know some of how you got interested, how you started in tempera. Maybe you can explain a little bit about that, and then how you started in Silverpoint.
Well, I was an art history major in college. I didn't study studio art, but I always wanted to be a painter. So I tried it off and on throughout my 20s into my early 30s, lived in Florence. I was an art furniture maker for a while, did a lot of different creative things, but eventually in the early 90s, I took a history of painting class taught by Chester Arnold. He's a wonderful painter. And we did a different medium every week. We did encaustic and fresco. And the week we did egg tempera, something resonated with me, and Chester recognized that. And he said, "You're going to be an egg tempera painter." I didn't know what he meant, but he was right. But I spent the next several years in the early 90s studying classical oil painting with a husband-wife couple, Numael and Shirley Politos, wonderful painters. And I went back and forth between oil and egg tempera, but I finally chose egg tempera as my primary medium. And it was Shirley Polito who, several years later in the early 2000s, knowing that I loved egg tempera, said to me, "I think you would like Silverpoint." And I said, "What Silverpoint?" I'd never even heard of it. So I went out and I bought a piece of silver jewelry wire, and I stuck it in a dowel, and I just started drawing my true gesso panels that I use for egg tempera. And that was it. I fell in love with it the way I fell in love with egg tempera.
Well, thank you. So what aspects of Silverpoint do you like? What are the qualities of Silverpoint that make it useful as a drawing medium?
Well, there's so many. I always think of, there's a quote from the movie Lawrence of Arabia, where a reporter asks, "What is it, Major Lawrence, that attracts you personally to the desert?" And Lawrence answers, "It's clean." And I always like that idea with metalpoint. There's something clean and precise and careful and elegant about it. There's an instructor at the Pennsylvania Academy, Jill Rupinski, and she calls Silverpoint the gourmet of line drawing. And I really like that quote. Thanks to Daryl Babatunde Smith for that quote. It really sums up so much about metalpoint, Silverpoint drawing. I also like that it's a quiet, meditative medium that you have to develop over time. It gradually emerges, and it's akin to egg tempera in that way.
Yeah.
So there's a patience, there's a focus, there's a quietness, there's a peacefulness about it. So I love that aspect of it. And finally, as you know, George, I love craft and science in art. And metalpoint gives so many opportunities for that because there's so many different supports and grounds. It's really an incredibly creative medium. So I love that part too.
So what are the challenges you find in working in Silverpoint?
Well, I'd first like to address what I think is one of the, it's not a misconception. I think it's a little overplayed, and that's that a lot of people say the big challenge in metalpoint is that it can't be erased. And it's true that it's not as amenable to erasing as graphite or charcoal. But in fact, there's ways to get around that. I say that because I don't want beginners to feel discouraged by the requisite draftsmanship. There's a wonderful drawing by Durr, the artist Durr, in the early 1500s of it's called Dog Resting. And they've looked at it under certain lights. I don't know what the, experiment they run on it, where they can see the charcoal drawing that underlies the Silverpoint dog. So Durr went in with an erasable medium charcoal, roughed in the dog, and then drew Silverpoint on top of that. And there are little ways you can erase on certain grounds that are built up in multiple layers, or you can sand. And so do you need good draftsmanship? Absolutely. But I don't want people to feel they have to have flawless, impeccable draftsmanship. There are ways to work around that. I think that the challenge of any medium, the most important thing is to love and be drawn to your medium. And then that kind of fascination and love pulls you through the inevitable challenges that becoming good at any medium is going to pose for you. So you have to make sure it really suits your nature and suits your visual goals as a painter. And then I think it will pull you through the learning curve and the challenges. There is a certain amount of craft involved, I think, in understanding the ground. And the more that you understand and can manage the ground, the more success you'll have in drawing and be able to achieve your goals. So you do have to apply a little bit of, understanding the ground and coming up with the ground that best suits what you're trying to achieve. So those are some things to consider.
And you've done quite a number of experiments with different types of grounds. And can you talk us through some of those things?
Sure. I like a lot of Silverpoint artists are challenged by is the limited value range. There's a peacefulness, there's a beauty to that limited value range. But on the other hand, something exciting in painting is a full range of values, or in drawing too. So a lot of metal point artists try to figure out, how do I extract more values from this medium where you're mostly in, the light to mid dark gray zone. So I've done a lot of playing around with adding things to grounds to increase the abrasion. You sent me many different things to try. I dug up a bunch of my own: bone ash, silica, pumice, barite, all sorts of different, white fillers. And tried them out in a lot of different, adding them to a variety of binders. I've tried oil binder, egg tempera, egg as a binder, gouache, gum arabic, casein, you name it. And that's what I mean about the creativity of metal point. If you can just raise the pigment load in a binder sufficiently to create a rough, irregular, toothy surface, and then if you make sure that that pigment load has a certain amount of hardness to it, so for example, titanium, pumice, silica, they're all in the 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, whereas most metal nibs are about a 2 to a 3, you're going to get abrasion. So playing with the different binders, playing with how much pigment I can add to the binder and still make it viable, a strong ground. And then adding the solids that will increase the hardness. So you don't have just tooth, but you have hardness. Tooth plus hardness is really the secret to a good metal point ground.
Right. And just for our audience that don't know what Mohs hardness, it's a measurement of mineral hardness, and it's a scale that goes from 1 to 10, 1 being, I believe it was soapstone or some form of talc.
Sometimes.
And then the hardest is, of course, diamonds.
Correct.
And so that's an important, because in addition to the minerals having hardness, of course, the metals have their own hardness, most of them being very soft.
Right. Well, let me just say, George, speaking of the number 10 diamond, that you can buy diamond dust. Mm-hmm. And so I am going to try this in the spring. I'm going to buy a small quantity of diamond dust and add it to a ground and just see what happens. Yeah, well, that would be worthwhile experimenting. And sure. I know you've done experiments with things like pumice, which is a silicate, and what is the other thing I know you've discovered is how the ground affects the color of the metal or the deposit. Right. Yeah, it's remarkable. And I would hate to say I discovered it, because I know plenty of other experienced Silverpoint artists have experienced this too, noting that metals tarnish differently depending on the ground. And I have done a series of ground tarnishing experiments where I took, I think it was 7 different metal nibs, and I applied them to, I believe, 8 different grounds, including plike paper, a black gesso, and then a bunch of other homemade and pre-prepared grounds for metal point. And then I exposed them to different tarnishing elements. Apple cider vinegar, very acidic, liver of sulfur, and then also garlic and onions. And the reason I know that garlic and onions affect the drawing is my husband, he's retired now, but he was a vegetable farmer. And whenever he harvested the garlic or onions in the adjoining building, my drawings would tarnish much more quickly. So I took, it was wow, this is really making
That's
a difference.
interesting.
Yeah. So I took these various sample panels with these different nib marks and grounds, and I exposed them to these elements for anywhere from 24 to 36, then 72 hours. And it was just remarkable how differently all the nibs colored depending on the ground. You would think the copper would look the same, it'd only be changed by the tarnishing element, but no, it was also affected by the ground for sure. And then the really illuminating thing was that after 72 hours, I would say maybe 40% of all marks completely disappeared. Because what a lot of people, obviously one of the things that people love about metalpoint is that the drawing tarnishes. It takes on a life of its own once you're done with it. It's exposed to elements and it changes color, and it mostly deepens in value. And so people love this magical, mysterious alchemy that takes place when they're done with the drawing. But it's important for artists to realize that tarnishing is a reaction to corrosive materials, attacking the metal. And if you overdo it with tarnishing, you will degrade the metal deposits on the drawing to the point where they fall off, and your drawing will disappear. Or, as you and I have talked about, zinc, if you expose it to a zinc metal point mark, if you expose it to certain tarnishing elements, can transition to white. And so you may not lose the particles, but they're no longer, visible on a white ground. So tarnishing is wonderful, but you do have to approach it with that understanding and a certain amount of caution.
Right. Yeah, that's a very important consideration, and because I know a lot of Silverpoint artists are experimenting with tarnishing. Of course, the most common one is liver of sulfur, but some of those results may be totally unexpected and usually pretty uneven. I think you found that also.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can have a copper point. Copper will tarnish to different colors depending on what the element is in the atmosphere. It can turn green or blue or a dirty brown. And you may have a part of the drawing that gets a spot of nice, rich green in the copper and then nowhere else. And there's something magical about the lack of control, and the drawing seems to have a mind of its own. But it can also be problematic at times, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you, now in your tempera painting, how do you don't use typically Silverpoint as a way to execute a drawing or in the tempera painting, but you have used combinations of kind of a mixed media approach.
Correct.
And we'll show one of these images. We were talking about one of these images. Maybe you can explain. You provided some images in raking light, and maybe you can explain a little bit what you did with that image.
Sure. There are painters who start their egg tempera paintings with metal point, which is not, it's traditional. It's not every traditional artist did it, but certainly many of them did. Fred Wessel, contemporary egg tempera master, does this beautifully. But I'm far too impatient for that. So when I do a metal point drawing, I tend to put it in a frame and sell it or give it to somebody, not paint on top of it. I admire Fred's approach. But no, I don't start paintings with metal point. But I do like to combine them with egg tempera. And so I've done several paintings in which I painted an egg tempera still life. And then I do a block of black casein paint in part of the image. And I like casein as a ground for metal point. A tubed casein as a percentage of oil, which once it cures is even harder. And I always spice it up with a little pumice or silica. And then I draw a quote for the painting in metal point. So egg tempera still life, casein, black background, and then a quote drawn in metal point, gold, silver, various points. It's a really nice combination because, as all metal point artists know, the metal image changes depending on how the light strikes it. So sometimes when you look at those paintings, you barely see the quote, and then you stand off to the side and the light strikes it in a raking way, and suddenly the quote lights up, and it's really magical and fun.
What supports do you do you typically use for your Silverpoint drawing?
Well, I like a rigid support both for painting and for drawing. And even when I was studying oil painting and everybody in the class was working on canvas, I made my own panels, rigid supports. I've always liked it's not just the control, it's the feeling of solidity underneath. I like that experience. So I always use panels, and I mostly use some sort of fiberboard. So that's primarily, sometimes I'll coat the fiberboard I'll put paper on top before I apply the ground. That's fun to do as well. But I also have done some drawings on heavyweight watercolor paper. As you know, George, I'm an inveterate mad scientist in the studio, and I like to try a little bit of everything. But mostly rigid supports like fiberboard.
What metal points do you use besides silver?
Yeah, of silver, a lot of people like sterling because it contains a percentage of copper, and so it tarnishes in a nice way. But I actually prefer pure silver. It's a little softer. I just like it. I love 24 karat gold. It's also a fairly soft metal. And I like soft metals because they abrade more readily. I have a pewter point and a bismuth point. And those, once you get to really soft metals, it's hard to make really precise points because they'll tend to bend under pressure. So my bismuth and my pewter points are fairly fat. They're more for shading or blocking in. I have a lead point, but I think I prefer the bismuth and the pewter. So I like aluminum. It's also a fairly soft metal. And many craft supplies are made from aluminum. So a tool that I use in a Tempera, it's called a needle piercing tool, and it's used by ceramicists to incise patterns. It's made from aluminum. It's a great metal point tool. So, if something's made from aluminum, it's probably a good metal point tool.
Sure. What advice do you have for artists who want to begin drawing in Silverpoint? How should they start?
Well, not every artist is interested in the finer points of the science and craft of their medium, and that's fine. And then there are, technical nerds like myself who love that part of it. So I'm not saying everybody has to become completely conversant on Mohs hardness scale or PVC, high pigment volume concentrate, which is the ratio of pigment to binder in a ground or paint. But the more you understand your ground, the more success you will have as a metal point artist. So to the extent you can understand, what makes a good ground, and it's not just the tooth that everyone speaks of, a certain amount of abrasion, a microscopic like sandpaper abrasion, it's also the hardness. And it's those two together that make a great ground. So to the extent you can understand the ground, that will help you a lot. And even though it's a very creative medium, and you can combine it with so many other mediums, as you know I do, George, I would say initially keep it simple so you really learn the nature of the mark. It's got a fairly limited value range. And if you try to amend that immediately by throwing on watercolor, tempera, or, if you go too fast to other mediums to make it work, you won't explore the full range of the point itself. When I first started, I did very simple drawings, lightly toned grounds, just pure silver point, and then a little bit of white heightening. And then gradually over the years, if you were to follow the progression of my images, you'd see they get more and more filled with other mediums. But I started for the first many years just with a simple silver point.
Well, how do you mount or protect your Silverpoint drawings once they're completed?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because metal point drawings are vulnerable. They, as we've talked about, they're vulnerable to tarnishing. They're also on this absorbent, irregular surface that can, things can attach to it. They can get dirty and the dust embed in that irregular surface. So they really do need to be protected. And what I mostly do is I frame under museum glass, but I don't really like artwork under glass. I like the immediacy, the physicality of a work of art. So I'm experimenting with varnishing metal point drawings. And as you and I have discussed in length, varnishing mediums that have these very irregular, porous, open surfaces, these high pigment volume concentrate surfaces like egg temper or metal point, is complicated because the initial varnish layer pretty much becomes part of the work of art. It adheres in a way that it's not readily removable. So I understand it's complicated. There are pros and cons to every option, but I'm basically trying to figure out how to varnish them akin to how I varnish my egg temper paintings, because I like that layer of protection that still allows the drawing to be so immediate and present and not behind glass.
So, Koo, you provided with us a very, very wonderful drawing, mixed media, of an oriole bird, and maybe you could talk a bit about that. Explain what you were doing in this particular, should we call it drawing, painting?
I think it's mostly a drawing, but I will explain, I promise. Yeah, that was, it's, as metal point artists know, even though the nibs of metal look very colorful, a gold nib is clearly different from a silver. Once you actually draw with these metal nibs, they're all a fairly similar range of grays with slight hints of color, but not nearly what a solid piece of metal looks like. They're all versions of gray. However, certain additives will bring out the coloration of a nib mark. I have found pumice and silica to slightly intensify the color of a mark that's within a mark. But the color of a nib really shows up nicely on top of a black ground. And so there are many options for black grounds, and that's how I started this oriole. My goal was to draw him using exclusively a variety of nibs to bring out the coloration in him. And in his chest, all those yellows and oranges are all done with gold and brass and copper, and I was able to achieve that. The silver in him, or the whites, are bismuth and pewter and silver, maybe a little aluminum, can't quite remember. And the blacks are the black ground. But when I'd finished the drawing, the range, you just can't get as great a value range on a dark ground. It's even harder than when working on a white ground. And he lacked a little something. So what I did is, instead of trying to play with values, I chose to play with color temperature. And I took the black background and I put a couple of coats of Prussian blue egg temper paint sponged on the black background. I added some sparkles to it, a little bit of mica powder, a little bit of silica. And then that cool background intensified the color in his warm breast of the oriole. And that seemed to make the drawing, get the excitement that I was looking for, was by doing that. And that's one of the great things about metal point. You can start to play with it in all these really creative ways. Mm-hmm.
So, Koo, can you explain what you did with this one image with the girl and has a cap? Looks like
Yep.
Really wonderful amount of texture going on in this particular drawing.
Yeah. Well, what I did in that drawing, that was a lot of fun. I worked with the Rublev temper ground as my ground, few additives to it to further increase the abrasion. And then I tinted it with a variety of colors. Something that's sort of fun to do is to think about ground like paint. And you can essentially paint with ground if you tint it different colors. And so I developed somewhat variation of color to get the sky and a bit of the landscape. And then I started working up my metal point drawing. But I wasn't getting enough from it. I wasn't getting enough depth of value or variety or atmosphere. So what I did is I took the original blue tinted temper ground and I thinned it, and I applied what I call a scumble, a very thin, transparent layer of the white over the whole drawing. I do this in my egg temper classes to my students all the time, where I scumble over, or they scumble over their images, and there's a moment of, what am I doing? I've worked so hard to build up this image, and now I'm covering it. But if the layer's thin enough, like a veil or a mist, it injects a bit of atmosphere. It unifies disparate marks. And in the case of metal point, it reinstates the ground. So once again, you're back to some of the original abrasion, so you can start building up your darks again. So I tried that, and it worked well. So then I tried it again, and I did it again, and I probably developed that drawing, knocked it back with a scumble of ground, developed it back and forth, 8 or 10, I lost track of how many times I scumbled over that with ground. And the end result was it gave it more atmosphere than I can sometimes get from my other metal point drawings where it's just the metal mark, which I love, but I like all this variety too. So that gives, I feel, that drawing a little more atmosphere because of all that layering of scumbles.
Can you explain what you did with this image of the rabbit? And it appears, of course, it's on paper with a gold leaf background, apparently, of course, on a wood panel.
Yep. So I did that drawing it's a handmade paper, a well-known company called Twin Rocker. It was a 320-pound, gorgeous, handmade, deckled edge paper. And when I finished the drawing, I floated it on a panel that I'd gold leafed, and it's raised about, I think 1/8 of an inch above the panel. There's a backing behind it, so it really looks like it floats above the gold. And the drawing itself was similar to the lily and landscape drawing, in which I started by developing a ground of different colors that would begin to, convey the sky versus the landscape. And built up layer after layer, did some scumbling. But what was a fun technique in that image was the brocade behind the rabbit. I rubbed some copper wool over the area where the brocade was to go. And then I placed down a commercial stencil. There's just fabulous stencils available now. And I took ground and I sponged on ground, to create the stencil pattern. And then I again rubbed copper wool over that stenciled on ground pattern. And then I, did that over and over with a couple of different stencils just to get that richness of layering. So yet again, another fun tool. Our stencils can be used to apply grounds and create different textures or patterns that you can then draw on top of with metal point. So lots of fun things that you can do.
Yeah, a lot of very interesting textures and patterns going on. It looks really nice.
Yeah, layering. Egg temper prepares you for infinite layering. And the same can be applied to metal point. It's also lovely to do a quick sketch in metal point. I'm not saying it's required, but for those of us who love to layer, metal point has that same potential, and it can yield some really wonderful atmospheric, rich results for sure.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. So was there anything else that we should mention?
Yeah. I want to say one more thing to beginners because, I teach a lot of workshops, and what I run into often are people who are understandably very eager to get better, and it takes time. And so I really want to encourage people because metal point is a medium that takes time both to acquire knowledge of the craft and the skill, but also just for the image to emerge. And, sometimes if people don't see results right away, they feel like they're doing something wrong, or it's me, or it's the medium, and it might not be either. These things just take time, and there's a wonderful Michelangelo quote, "Genius is eternal patience." So for beginners, what I always say is give yourself time to get good. Just, get lost in the process and give yourself time.
Right. And that's so true for so many traditional mediums.
Yes,
true
exactly.
For tempera. I know it's for fresco. Very true. And a lot of people work at it for hours and then go, well, nothing's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And you just be patient. Be patient.
Yeah, patience is a big part of that.
Yeah, for sure.
And that seems to be more and more difficult to do these days.
I think so.
Even with artists.
And in fact, it's a good antidote. That's one of the reasons I value these mediums, because it is a good antidote to the rush and lack of patience we're all experiencing these days, is to get lost in these mediums and have faith and trust in the results if you hang in there. Right.
Very good. Well, thank you, Koo, for taking the time to talk to us and share some of your experiences with Silverpoint and your artwork and the really incredible variety of things that can be done that you've shown us, not just, this black and white drawing, but even incorporating with color.
Yeah, well, my pleasure as always. I'm so grateful to you and Tanya for your support of traditional mediums and traditional artists and for sharing this knowledge with others, because I know there are so many artists who love these traditional ways of working. So it's a joy to share it with others. Thank you.
Well, thank you.